Welcome back to the Euronet Plus Summit Debate, broadcasting live from the European Parliament in Brussels. We're going to be talking today about the next year's European election. Believe it or not, it's just 1 year away as of today. I'm Dave Keating, and I'm joined today by four members of the European Parliament: centre-right German MEP David McAllister, centre-left Slovenian MEP Tanja Fajon, Green Spanish MEP Ernest Urtasun, and left Irish MEP Leah Riada. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. I'm going to be taking some questions from our network of journalists located around Europe, and I'll also be asking you some questions myself. And maybe for a starting question, I hate to start out on a negative note, but we all know that European Parliament elections have been plagued by issues of participation and engagement. They're actually, this is 4 decades of direct elections to the European Parliament, but every year since these elections have happened, turnout has gone down. So that's been one major problem that has been observed. The other major problem is that people tend to vote based on national issues rather than European issues, rather than the issues that are actually legislated on in this parliament. For instance, if they're unhappy with their governing party, they'll punish that party in the European election, even though it has nothing to do with what happens here in this institution. So I wanted to start out by asking each of you, how, in a year's time, can we get European citizens more engaged with what happens here in this building so that they would be motivated to go to the polls and vote based on what actually happens here? Maybe, David, let's start with you.
Well, from my point of view, latest polls show that still a broad majority of European citizens will vote on national issues, but the numbers are increasing. More and more citizens are also interested in European affairs. It will still take a long time to actually form a European public opinion, but since 2014 we have seen a shift. European issues are becoming more and more important, and that's why we will campaign on national issues, but also on European issues in all 27 member states, which will be participating at the next European elections.
Will you try to combine those national issues with the European issues?
Well, you can't really differentiate between European and national policies anyhow, no longer. I mean, it's all interconnected. But for instance, the Spitzenkandidaten process will be one cornerstone to make this European election not a sum of 27 national elections, but to make European citizens clear that there's a lot at stake, and there is actually quite a lot at stake at this European election next year, because what we need in the next European Parliament is once again a responsible, stable majority for a European Commission to tackle all the challenges we're facing.
Tanja, what about you?
I think it's quite of a challenge how to make people understand and feel engaged in European politics. We are struggling about that for years. Now, we went through several crises. And I think there is a little bit of a positive movement or sentiment after Brexit. When you ask Europeans today, they want to see more engagement, European policies around security or around migration or energy or climate change. You feel that people got a bit afraid, but we have to bring them back to the process itself. Too often European policies or institutions are perceived as something behind a closed door, project for the political elites. And I think for us politicians it's quite a challenge. We have to go back to the citizens, back to the streets, talk to them, listen to them, and this is what we are trying, in fact. I'm not sure this is the only formula how to engage people back, because, as you said, we first, or citizens first, would discuss on national issues, what concerns most their daily life, but it's our responsibility how to engage them and how to communicate the language of European policies to the simple citizens. This is quite a challenge because too often it's very abstract and it's very difficult language to understand and too far from their hearts.
Ernest, how do you think we can make these elections more European and less national?
Well, I tend to agree that any elections mixes different areas of political decision-making. Also, local elections can be mixed with national elections. I mean, it's very difficult to separate them. But I think that as far as the European elections are concerned, I think two issues are very important. First is to be a bit more innovative in how our citizens participate. And I agree the Spitzenkandidaten process, so the idea that every political family has a candidate to be president of the Commission, is important. It would have been very important, in my humble opinion, to have also the European constituency, like to elect members for a whole European constituency. Unfortunately, that was rejected, but I think that would have been an innovative, a step further in the process of creating more links with citizens. But then there's another side of the story, which I think is even more important, which is that we need to politicize the debate, and we need to discuss about issues that are dear to the citizens' daily lives. We cannot have a political debate about European affairs, about institutions, processes, or very general, broad terms. We need to discuss about social Europe, about unemployment, about how, from a European perspective, we can tackle those issues. I think that is the way. When you politicize decision-making process and campaign through things that are affecting the life of our citizens, this is how you engage citizens in politics. And I think this has been probably lacking in the last years.
Ed, what do you think?
Well, I think all politics are local, not to mind national, so you have to drill down even from a very local level and what affects the people there. And we as MEPs, I think we do live in a bubble. We can't help that because we're here so often that you do get disconnected. And what we think everybody is talking about is not actually what they're talking about at all. So we have to have a reality check as MEPs, I think, because unless we bridge that, we're kind of up against it. I also think that Brexit has been a huge game changer in terms of people's view, certainly in Ireland, of Europe. And they're talking more about what it means to be Irish, but at the same time part of a union, and they don't want to be removed like the British people are. So I think that has changed it ever so much in that. But look, I also think you're absolutely right. The language that we use here is so far removed from the ordinary, daily people that go about their lives. They can't access funding. We talk about simplification here all the time, but it never really translates to the person on the doorstep. And unless we do that in a meaningful way, that takes direct responsibility here, I think we are really up against it, because at the end of the day, people are not really as concerned about Europe as we like to think they are, because we are too insulated.
Well, let's go ahead and get out of that bubble. We can take some comments out in the streets of Europe. We're going to hear from some voters in Slovenia about how they're feeling right now about the EU. We're going to take that video now.
Bolj sproščeno, lažje potujete, drugače pa cene so šle vsaj gor, standard pri nas je pač nižji.
Jaz mislim, da je šlo vse na slabše, nič na boljše.
Je življenje, skratka, se je dvignilo, vse ne, v nekih normah, ampak kar se tiče pa vseh ostalih stvari, ki gledamo, Mariborstvo se pa poslabšalo.
Mislim, da glede na to, kam smo vstopili, bi lahko bilo boljše.
Če gledam z vidika mladih, kar se tiče zaposlitev, je sigurno slabše, ker mladi nimajo zaposlitev, drugače pa normalno, prednost pa so odprte meje.
V vsakem primeru pozitivno, zdaj ta nostalgija, ko pač jo imamo za Jugoslavijo, bo vedno verjetno prisotna.
Ko imamo Slovenci priložnost voliti tudi naše slovenske poslance. Ni jih veliko, ampak nekaj pa jih je. Ne?
Žal se izogibam vseh teh političnih stvari, kako se gleda.
Ne grem.
Evropske volitve so zelo pomembne, zato ker vendarle nam Bruselj diktira življenje.
So I guess a mix of opinions there. I think I could tell you recognize some of the scenes there behind them. Let's take a question from our partner station, RTV Slovenia, which is based on some of those opinions that they heard on the streets.
Lydia Petkovic from RTV Slovenia. According to recent surveys, most Slovenian citizens feel they belong to the European Union. In fact, many of us feel very optimistic about the EU's future, despite growing populism and Euroscepticism. However, voter turnout for the European parliamentary elections is lower. In 2014, it was only 24%. More than 85% of young people stayed at home. Why the paradox between people feeling and acting as Europeans? What is the European Union doing in order to increase the people's engagement? Thank you.
And of course, this is a trend across Europe, not just in Slovenia, but Tanya, how do you respond to that concern for Slovenia?
I think it's exactly what I meant before. People don't feel they can influence. They have that they are engaged in the processes as such. Brussels and European policies are too abstract, too far away from them. So this is a challenge to us, how to communicate in concrete solutions what is daily changing and affecting their lives. It was right. In Slovenia, we are still, having European, I would say, enthusiasm. We still belong to European Union and we like to be a member state. We see the benefits, but it's not only the European elections. We just had recently a referendum with so low turnout that it failed. It's also when it comes to now national elections, we are afraid of how low turnout will be and what will be on the effect on the credibility on the elections. So I think it's more the general question also how much the policy is really and politicians are credible today. We are pretty much discredited in the eyes of our citizens and we have to regain here the confidence back. It goes the same to European elections. Maybe the challenge is, of course, bigger also to national elections. And I think it's really to communicate in concrete, simplified language, to bring topics close to them and make them feel part of the process.
Yeah, it's interesting. As an American, I often like to point out that the European Parliament turnout is roughly the same as the US Congress midterms. They're in generally the same area. So it may just be a larger question of democratic participation. What do you guys think? I mean, what explains the difference between somebody who says, I'm happy my country is in the EU, I feel somewhat European, but I'm not going to bother turning out?
But do you mean in terms of getting them to engage with that? Or?
Yeah, or getting them to just come to the polls on that day.
I think in general, you're absolutely right. There's a kind of an inertia. Generally, when it comes to general elections or local elections, a lot of it can be individual-based as opposed to party-based. There's a lot of different dynamics at play. But I think we simply have to reach out, and especially to our young people, because we have, certainly in Ireland and I'm sure other countries, we have quite a young generation and population coming up, and it's to try and get them to exercise their democratic right to vote and to have debates. And we actually have to get out of these institutions and talk to these people. We spend so long in here and they often look at us as being politicians that are on the gravy train. That's the first thing you'll hear about the EU. They'll say, oh, you're an MEP, so you're on the gravy train and, you don't really care, you don't really know what's happening and what can you do anyway? And they don't realise that as an MEP you can do quite a lot. So it's how to communicate that message more effectively so that they know that we can change and we can do quite a lot even as a single MEP, not to mind being part of a wider group. So I think that's the main thing, to try and get that dialogue and debate going.
Let's take our next question. This one is coming from Hungary. We're going to Balac from our partner station MTV AMR.
Do you think the migration and immigration policy could be a decisive topic of the European elections next year? The Hungarian member of the European Commission, Mr. Navracsics, argued in an interview recently that the campaign in most of the member states will focus on migration as a common challenge for the whole of Europe. And as the Hungarian Prime Minister, Mr. Orbán, said recently, that the European elections will be a kind of referendum on the migration.
What do you guys think? Is migration inevitably going to be a major focus? David, we saw in the German elections last year, it was a pretty big focus. Do you expect that to be repeated next year for the European elections?
Well, polls show that the issues are very different in the 27 countries. What is a major topic? You have of course, in South Europe, unemployment, youth unemployment is a bigger topic than, for instance, in my home country, Germany. But of course, migration is one of the top issues in Europe. We have different views in member states. Some member states are open for migration. Others, like Hungary, take a critical point of view. But we will be debating certain questions. What can we do to tackle irregular migration to Europe? Because this is, of course, a huge challenge for all of us. So it's about what can we do to improve our relations with Africa? What can we do to secure our external borders better? What can we do with those people who are entitled to stay because they are asylum seekers, they are recognized refugees? How can you have more solidarity between the EU member states? Of course, these issues will be discussed, certainly in my home country, Germany, and the last national elections already showed that this issue was the issue number one for people.
Well, Ernest, how do you think, how can we address the concerns of voters about the migration issue without pandering to kind of nationalistic urges? How do you straddle that line where you address voters' legitimate concerns, but you don't go too far in dangerous directions?
My fear with the debate on migration and refugees always has been that I have the impression that some governments at national level, they give up too much into arguments that come from the far right. I mean, this is really the bad way of handling the debate. I think we need to face reality, and reality is that we have, of course, a very unbalanced distribution of hosting of the refugees and migration, and this needs a European response. This is very clear. But we should not, absolutely not, during the campaign, starting caving in the debate towards extreme arguments that we have too much refugees, that we have too much migrants, that we need to secure further our borders, because this only gives the extreme right more room to grow in the elections if we start using their own arguments. So I think that we need to have a serious debate about that. A serious debate for me is that we have a failing European cooperation model on migration and refugees, and that there are member states that are not assuming their responsibilities. Germany is, but Spain is not. So I think that here is where the debate should lie. Do we have an efficient model to receive refugees, to be in solidarity, to have legal ways of entry? Do we have that or not? But we need to have a serious debate. And when xenophobic and anti-migration arguments come, we need to confront them, but not giving up to those arguments. That is totally a big mistake during an election campaign, because it will feed the extreme right.
Aside from migration, what do you guys think are going to be the big dominant issues next year?
Well, for us, Brexit has to be because it's so integrated, and even we're currently discussing, as you know, the multi-annual financial framework. I sit as a coordinator on the Budgets Committee, so perhaps I'm in my own bubble when it comes to that, but it is so intrinsically linked in how we're going to be spending 7 years of an EU budget. And that's going to cut across CAP and cohesion and structural funds, which is going to have a direct link, obviously, to the person on the ground, whether it's somebody looking for Erasmus or somebody relying on CAP payments. So I think that's another way of how we can engage with our citizens to say, look, we rely so much on EU funding. Of course, we need to make it accessible because it's just overly bureaucratic. But Brexit is certainly dominating Ireland. And I would also think that militarisation is going to be a huge issue, because we talk about Ireland, we hold our neutrality very dear. We've seen an erosion of that by joining up to PESCO. We talk about migration, and yes, there's a humanitarian response that we absolutely have to have. But for Irish people, I think we're very afraid, and we have to be robust against any erosion of our sovereignty and signing up to spending a lot of money on militarisation, which is not something that Ireland joined up with the EU for. And finally, I think it's important that we go back to the roots of why we joined the EU, which is for trade, for peace and stability. And that has always been the cornerstone that I think we have to adhere to.
I imagine the attention on defence union would vary significantly by country. David, what about in Germany?
The statement of the Irish colleague just showed how different the issues are in our member states. Brexit and neutrality are two issues which in my home country, Germany, would probably not play such a big role, to put it politely. In my country, it's the economy, it's security, it's the fight against terror, it's migration, and it's the future of our joint currency, the euro. These are topics which are interesting for German citizens. And this just shows you that you can talk as much as you want about a European public opinion. In the end, European elections will always be national, regional and local too. And that's okay. And we have to address the issues our voters are concerned and not those which the European bubble is interested in.
Let's take our next question from Spain. We're going to go to Diego from our partner station, ES Radio Castilla y León.
The results of recent elections in different member states showed how strong nationalist parties are. They came to power in some large cities or gained seats in national parliaments of Italy, Spain, in regions like Catalonia, or even in Germany. The strength of these Eurosceptic parties could also be reflected in the next European elections. What will be your plan to face Eurosceptic arguments during the election campaign?
Yeah, it should be pointed out that 1/3 of the parliament in 2014 was Eurosceptic. That's a huge portion. Do you guys think, based on everything that's happened over the past 4 years, do you expect that Eurosceptic proportion of the parliament to go up? Do you expect the recent events, as he explained, to have an effect on the makeup of this parliament next year?
I mean, first, if I may, Euroscepticism as such is not a bad thing. It's always good as a reminder what we can do different or analyze where we stand. the dangerous Euroscepticism or radicalism or these extreme right forces or nationalist forces. This is a danger for the stronger European unity in the future. How to counter that? It's also to again, we have to, in parallel, when we discuss migration, we have to understand the whole holistic approach and the challenges Europe is facing and how to have a serious debate. But on the other hand, we have, of course, to make measures to improve economy, to make Europeans feel secure. And security, which will be also in Slovenia one of the topics, it's not only security in a militarized way, but also well-being, social security. These are the topics where Europeans once will feel safe, will have jobs, will not have reasons to fear for their future safety, then I think we will easier also communicate European policies and the integration as such. That I think it's also how to find the extreme right and these national forces that are going to a very dangerous isolation, which in the long run, we all know that leads to instability, wars, and fall apart. We have in Slovenia a recent experience with fall apart of Yugoslavia and wars that were very bloody for our region.
What do you guys think? What are you expecting in terms of the far right and Eurosceptic makeup?
Well, I think that the best way to confront the rise of anti-European movements is to try to reconnect EU priorities with daily life citizens. I mean, I always ask the question, for a young unemployed in my country, in Spain, which of course is going to be one of the major issues in the campaign, what has the EU done in the last years to solve his personal life, his personal experience? And I think in general, in the last years, people have felt totally abandoned by the European project in the social suffering and the social problems in many member states. And probably this is a very much southern perspective, but this is the case also, I think, in other regions of Europe. And I think we need to reconnect that. How to do that? That's not easy. But I think, for instance, we are not talking about a pillar of a social Europe. So let's make that a priority for the next campaign, and let's all discuss how this social Europe that we all want to bring in again can help these people in their daily lives. And I think it's very important. In some member states and in the south, that is very clear. Fighting anti-European movements means reconnecting EU priorities with daily lives of citizens and the social sufferings of the last years. In the last years, the EU has meant the troika, the cuts, austerity. And this is the image that is portrayed in many member states. And we need to reverse that.
In some members, in Spain, certainly, but in other member states, maybe it's not as much.
In many of them, not only in Spain, but also Greece, also Italy, also Ireland, and also other member states.
We're still paying for that, by the way. We're still paying,
exactly.
and our grandchildren will still be paying for that. I think it's about democratic accountability as well. And I think certainly when we were, one of those parties that were Euro-critical and still are critical, but it's not, we're not anti-EU, but we are looking for reform. We want to be more democratically accountable. And having people that are unelected at the helm is certainly not accountable to people at home when they see that, and they just see, these fat cats on big fat wages, and they weren't even, democratically elected. So
do you think the Spitzenkandidaten process helps with that image? This is the system in which the largest party elected to the parliament gets to choose the European Commission president. Has that helped? Was that for the first time in 2014? Has that helped with the appearance of legitimacy for that democratic accountability?
Well, it's a step in the right direction, but at the same time, I think we need to go far more beyond that. And I'm not just talking about how different, the commissioners were elected or put into their positions. I think it's about looking at the reform of the common fisheries policy, looking at reform of the common agricultural policy, and updating it, because it's a bit far removed from where our farmers and our fisheries and other industries are at today. But of course, we move at such a snail pace here that by the time we catch up with what's really happening on the ground, we nearly need to be legislating again to reflect the needs of the people and the reality on the ground.
I want to bring up a slide. We've talked about Brexit a little bit and how it will influence the elections, and I think we all agree it will vary intensely by member state. But we've been in a partnership with our social media monitoring partner, Brandwatch. They've been looking at how the Brexit conversation is playing out across Europe. And they've identified which countries have been talking about Brexit the most on social media and which have been talking about it the least. So I think we have no surprise which is talking about it the most, but I found interesting that more people are talking about it in France than in Ireland.
Maybe I should stand for elections in France.
Also, I mean, I think there's a couple of countries. Belgium probably doesn't surprise me. That's probably us talking about it here in Brussels. But Germany is pretty far up there as well. Let me ask you guys, how much is Brexit factoring into the European conversation? Is it in some way serving as a kind of crash course in how the EU works and what it's all about? I mean, in Germany, I know I've heard this a bit from Germans on the ground, that they've learned more about the EU in the past year than they knew ever before, just from watching coverage of Brexit. Is that your experience?
My experience is that in general, Germans see Brexit very critical. There's nothing good about Brexit. It's a lose-lose situation for both sides. And the huge majority of Germans presumably deeply regret that the United Kingdom is leaving. On the other hand, Germans tend to be pragmatic and they say we have to face reality. We can't change things. And obviously we have to accept this democratic decision taken by a narrow majority of the British people. And what Germans are now interested in is getting this divorce done, getting it done in an orderly manner, and always having in mind that this was a divorce we didn't ask for. So whatever happens, the UK will remain our neighbour, our trading partner, our NATO ally, and let's try and find the closest possible relation with the British, but without sacrificing our European values. And one thing is clear, a country which leaves the European Union can't be in a similar or even better position than a member state. That's common sense for Germans. And this is really what they want to get it done. But it's not a major issue in the general debate in Germany.
Ernest, how would you say it's affecting the European debate in Spain?
Well, it's affecting, I think, in a certain way. I have to say that it has reinforced a bit European sentiment. When you see, I think, but that is something happening in many member states. Brexit has helped a bit, finding also thinking that, well, that the project is worth it and that we need to fight for it. That had an effect in Spain. But also there are concrete issues that are being discussed a lot in Spain, particularly the rights of the Spanish workers there, and also the workers and a lot of retired people from Britain that live in Spain, and how this will be solved. This is a hot issue in Spain, as you can imagine. So I think that Spaniards think and hope as well that the divorce should be done, that it should be done in an orderly manner, that nobody would lose its previous rights. I think this is very, very important. So on the issue of rights of workers and of mutual residents here and there, I think this should be a top priority for sure. And this is, I think, what the majority of the Spanish debate is about Brexit at the moment.
Well, let's take a question related to Brexit from Germany, from journalist Claudia Knopke from our partner station AMS.
Hello, everybody from Germany. 1 year ahead of the European elections and a little bit less ahead of the fulfilled Brexit. So until now, the path to Brexit was paved with a lot of headaches, tough discussions, and also new experiences as the EU had to trigger Article 50 for the first time. And I would like to know, is there any lesson to be learned, or could that even bring up the need to modify the treaties in order to be better prepared or in a more practical way for a possible next time?
So it's interesting, obviously, the Lisbon Treaty is what brought in the ability to leave the EU, which is kind of funny when you think about how controversial it was in the UK. Should there be a more standardized process if a country wants to leave the EU? Isn't it only fair to let countries leave in the most simple and efficient way possible?
I think you have to, because the reality is Brexit happened, like it or not. And as you say, we have to face the reality. And certainly, I think there is some mechanism has to be put in place to allow those countries that have democratically voted to leave, that they are entitled to leave. But however, of course, Brexit is so unique because in the north we had 56% who wanted to remain. They're still EU citizens and they're Irish citizens. So that rights-based approach has to be applied to them, because they're citizens of the EU and of Ireland. So it's quite unique, I think, in that sense, Brexit. Whereas if another country left without having those complications, it might be a cleaner break. Of course, for us, it would be much easier if we just had a united Ireland, because then it relieves the headache for England, it relieves the headache for everybody, and we should have a right to have a referendum on that. But I think the mature thing would be to have some kind of mechanism that doesn't draw out as long as we've seen this, because the economic impact, the integrity of the peace process, for instance, if we go back to a hard border, all of those issues are very much key to us. But it's only the mature thing to do. Have a look at what mechanisms can be put in place. I'm not saying that we're, saying countries should have the option to leave if they want, but you have to respect the democratic right of people as well.
But even without the complicated situation in Ireland, what's really striking is the economics. I mean, it is just very economically difficult for the UK to be a Western European country outside of the European Union. That's what this process is showing. So is that fair? If, let's say the UK stayed in for economic reasons, they realized this would be economic suicide to not be in the EU, and yet we don't really want to be in the EU. We don't feel European. Should there not be a second tier, a revived EFTA, a better EEA, something that would satisfy some of these more Eurosceptic countries on the periphery that they could economically feasibly leave?
But nobody's forced to be a member of the European Union. We have countries which are in the single market and are not in the European Union, like Norway, like Iceland, nor Liechtenstein. But the decision to be a member of the European Union means that you have to be committed that the European Union is more than just a single market. The European Union is a union of values. We are a political project, and this is something which apparently a lot of British colleagues never really fully understood. But to your question on Article 50, I hope that Article 50 will never be triggered again. But if we reform the treaty at some stage, we should have a closer look at Article 50, because it's not 100% actually clear. I think those people who actually once formulated Article 50 were hoping that it would never be put in use.
I think that a single market, participating in a single market, would be a good solution for the UK. But of course, then you have to accept the full freedoms, contributions to the budget, and accept the ruling of the CGUA. And here, of course, many of people who campaign for Brexit, probably they found themselves in a difficult position to explain that probably what they said during their campaign of the referendum was wrong. But I think that at the end of the day, the most easy solution would be to be a member of the single market. But then that has conditions. There's no cherry picking here. That Europe has been very clear on that.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you guys very much for an excellent discussion. And thanks for you at home for watching this Euronet Plus Summit debate.